In this video, I'm going to show you how to work the long tail cast on. There are many different ways to cast on in knitting, and casting on is the process of getting your first stitches onto the needle. But the long tail cast on is a really good place to start if you're new to knitting, and as an experienced knitter, it's still one of the cast on methods I use the most. It's elastic, meaning that you can stretch your stitches out, but it'll bounce back into shape as well. It's got a firm bottom edge, so it holds its shape well. That also means working into your stitches on the first row is relatively easy. Your cast on will sort of hold them in shape well. So to get started, you'll need some yarn and some needles. I'm using a circular needle, but you can also work this cast on straight needles. If you're doing so, you'll want to work the cast on onto just one of your two needles. The long tail cast on gets its name from the fact that you start with a long tail of yarn. So you're going to pull out a tail of yarn, and you want to make it about 3 times the width of your cast on stitches, and then add about this much extra for a tail to weave in. So I'm just going to cast on a small number of stitches, so maybe about this wide. So I'm going to start by pulling out 3 times that length and then add about 6 inches, 15 centimeters for the tail. I'm going to pinch my yarn there. I've got the tail end here and then the ball end sort of behind. And you'll often see this cast on started with a slip knot. The slip knot isn't necessary, and I prefer not to use it because I find, especially in a piece that I'm not seaming, it creates a little bump or visible knot at the corner of my work. So I'm just going to pinch the yarn and then take my needle, just casting on onto one straight needle or one tip of a circular needle, and lay the yarn over the needle so I've got the tail end towards me and then the ball end away from me. And it's just draped over the needle, which I've got in my right hand, and then I'm going to grab both strands with my left hand, and I'm going to grab it with the bottom 3 fingers on my left hand, leaving my index finger and my thumb free. And then I'm going to put my index finger and my thumb through that loop, and I can just pull those. I'm still gripping it with my bottom 3 fingers in my left hand, not too tightly. And it's sometimes described as sort of a slingshot shape, that you've got the yarn making the sort of elastic of your slingshot. And I'm just using my right index finger to kind of keep a hold on that yarn on the needle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the needle towards me and then under this front strand on my thumb, scoop it up, and then I'm going all the way to the back over this strand on the index finger. I go over it and then scoop under it, and then I'm going to pull that back through the loop on my thumb. And that's our first stitch. I'm going to release my thumb, and then to pull it tight, I'm going to put my thumb back through this space. So I've released that loop that made the stitch, then I'm going to go back through to kind of open up our slingshot again, and by doing that I'll snug up the stitch I just made on my needle. So that's our first cast on stitch. So we've got 2 stitches because our first loop where we just lay the yarn of the needle forms a stitch. We're going to count that, so we've got 2 stitches, and then we're going to repeat that. So the needle comes towards me, over the strand closest to me on the thumb. I'm going to go over it and then under, lift it up, all the way to the back, over the strand on the index finger, and then scoop under it and pull it through the loop on the thumb. Release your thumb and use your thumb to pull the yarn nice and tight. You don't want to make it too tight, you want to be able to knit into this row. So you'll get a feel for what a nice amount of tension is on that. And it will depend a bit on your project as well, how loosely you want to cast on. So I'm going to show you how to make a stitch one more time, and then I'll show you how to make sure that your cast on doesn't get too tight. So to make another stitch, the needle comes towards you, over that strand on your thumb, then under it, to the back, over the strand on your index finger, scoop under it, and then back through the loop on your thumb. Your thumb to snug the yarn up. And then what you can do to make sure that your stitches are sort of nice and firm, you have a nice firm edge that doesn't end up wavy, but also isn't so tight it's pulling in, or that it makes it hard to knit into on the first row, is that you can make sure your stitches are spread out a little bit on the right needle, that there's a little bit of space between them. And for most projects, I aim for about the same amount of space as the width of my needle. And by putting that space between them and making sure that there's enough yarn in the stitch, and the yarn will kind of flow from the stitch into this part underneath, but that will mean I've got enough elasticity that my edge won't pull in and that I'll be able to knit into my stitches nice and easily. If you are working a project where you want a really loose cast on, there are other options. You can make sure there's an even bigger space between your stitches, or some people like to cast on a larger needle or even over 2 needles held together. So if I wanted to keep things loose, I could make sure I've got an even bigger space here and just maintain that with all of my cast on stitches. You can see how if you sort of release the tension and then pull your thumb, you can play around with that tension. So once more, to make a stitch, bring the needle towards you, over the front strand on your thumb, pick it up, to the back, over the strand on your index finger, and then under it and pull that through the loop on your thumb. And keep casting on like that until you've cast on your total number of stitches. When you've cast on your desired number of stitches, it should look something like this. I've got a nice length of tail left. It's enough to weave in at the end if I need to, enough that it's not going to unravel, but not so long that I'm going to accidentally start knitting with it or get kind of tangled up. And you can see my stitches will slide along the needle nice and easily. They're not so tight that they get stuck. And you can see how elastic this cast on method is if I sort of stretch things out. So that's the basic long tail cast on. It's definitely my most used cast on for any kind of general purpose project. Anytime I want a cast on edge that's firm, elastic, and blends into my fabric well, then I'll reach for the long tail cast on. It really is my default cast on technique, so it's a great one to have in your toolbox